December 1914. Europe had been at war for only a few months. What began with the assassination of an archduke had grown into something no one could easily control. Millions of men were now facing each other across a battlefield that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. They lived in trenches. They slept in mud. They watched artillery tear apart the landscape. And every day, they were ordered to kill men they had never met. But then came Christmas, and something happened that neither army had planned, something that would become one of the most extraordinary moments of the First World War. By December, the soldiers on the Western Front had begun to understand what this war really meant. The grand promises of a quick victory had disappeared. Instead, there were trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, cold rain, and bodies lying in the space between the opposing lines. This strip of land became known as no man's land. It was a place where even a few meters could mean the difference between life and death. The British and French occupied one side, the Germans occupied the other, and between them was a battlefield that seemed impossible to cross. Then, as Christmas approached, something unusual began happening. German soldiers placed small Christmas trees along their trenches. Their candles could be seen glowing through the darkness. Some began singing Christmas carols. Across the battlefield, British soldiers heard them. And instead of answering with gunfire, they answered with a song. For a few moments, the battlefield sounded less like a war zone and more like Christmas. Then, in some places along the front, the shooting stopped. A German soldier climbed out of his trench. He stepped into no man's land. Slowly, carefully. He was taking an enormous risk. But the British soldiers did not shoot. More men emerged, then more. Soldiers who had spent months trying to kill one another were suddenly standing face to face. They shook hands. They exchanged cigarettes. They shared food. Some traded buttons, badges, and small souvenirs. They showed each other photographs of their families. And in some locations, they helped bury the dead who had been lying between the trenches. For the first time in months, these men could see the person behind the uniform. A German soldier wasn't simply the enemy. He was a young man who had a family, a home, a mother, perhaps a wife, perhaps children waiting for him to return. And the same was true on the other side. There are also accounts of soldiers kicking a football around no man's land. The exact details of these games have been debated by historians, and they were certainly not happening everywhere along the front. But the larger truth is remarkable enough. In several areas, soldiers deliberately stopped fighting. They were not generals. They were not politicians. They were ordinary men who had been sent to war. And for a brief moment, they chose not to behave like enemies. But the Christmas truce was never an official ceasefire. The commanders had not ordered it. In fact, many military leaders were deeply unhappy about what was happening. The war depended on soldiers believing that the enemy was someone to be defeated. And now, across the trenches, soldiers were discovering something dangerous. They had more in common with the men opposite them than they had been told. So the armies worked to prevent another Christmas truce. Commanders ordered their soldiers not to fraternize with the enemy. Artillery and machine gun fire eventually returned. The footballs disappeared. The Christmas trees went dark, and the war continued for another 3.5 years. Millions would eventually die in the First World War. The men who had shared cigarettes and Christmas greetings would return to their trenches. Some of them would never see another Christmas. Some would be killed only days later. Others would spend the rest of their lives carrying memories of that strange night. A night when the war briefly disappeared. The Christmas truce of 1914 was not a victory. It did not end the war. It did not change the borders of Europe. It did not stop the killing. But it revealed something that the machinery of war could never completely erase. Behind every uniform, there was a human being. And sometimes, when the guns fell silent, the men on opposite sides remembered it. Perhaps that is why the Christmas truce has survived in our memory for more than a century. Not because it was the moment the war ended, but because for one brief moment, the people fighting the war remembered that they were human first. This is the origin of the Christmas truce of 1914.